My name is Jack Cole. I'm a 45-year-old carpenter. For 8 months, I've been buying more crooked cucumbers from the widow's stand than any man could use. Her triplet daughters never speak, just watch me like little sentinels. Last Saturday, the boldest one tugged my sleeve and whispered, "Mama baked your favorite pie. She remembered you said you like blackberry." I stood there with a paper sack of squash, the air gone still. I'd mentioned that pie only once, a throwaway comment. I realized I wasn't coming for the vegetables. The widow's name is Sarah. Her husband died in a harvesting accident 2 years ago. She wraps every purchase in brown paper with a care that feels like prayer. I'm a widower myself, 3 years now. I told myself I was done with starting over, that driving this back road every Saturday was just about fresh produce. But those little girls peeled back the truth I couldn't name. I'd fallen for their mother without permission. Now the question hung in the air: would I let a dead man's memory keep me from the living, or would I finally sit at a table that wasn't empty? I'd lost my wife, Claire, to a brain aneurysm 3 years earlier. She was 39. We never had children. After the funeral, I buried myself in work. I took every carpentry job within 100 miles, framing houses, hanging cabinets, anything that kept my hands busy and my mind numb. My crew would leave at 5 and I'd stay until dark, sanding a piece of oak until it felt like silk beneath my palm. I told myself I was fine. I was a man who fixed things. I just couldn't fix an empty house. The first time I stopped at Sarah's stand, it was an accident. A detour on County Road 9 sent me down a back road I'd never traveled. I saw a hand-painted sign that said "Fresh Vegetables" nailed to a fence post. Behind it, a wooden table sagged under zucchini, crooked cucumbers, and tomatoes so ripe their skins had split. A woman in a faded blue dress sat on an overturned bucket, her hair pulled back with a red bandana. Beside her stood 3 identical little girls, maybe 4 years old, wearing matching yellow sundresses. None of them spoke. They just watched my truck pull in with those big, solemn eyes. I bought a bag of green beans I didn't need, mostly because I felt sorry for her. Her hands trembled when she made change. She wrapped the beans in brown paper like she was handling something precious. I said thank you and drove home. The next Saturday, I found myself turning down that same road again. I told myself the beans had been good. That was a lie. The beans were tough as leather. For 8 months, I came back every Saturday. I learned her name was Sarah. Her husband, Tom, had been crushed by a combine harvester in a harvesting accident 2 autumns ago. The triplets Lily, Rose, and Violet were born prematurely after the accident. She'd gone into early labor from the shock. Tom never met his daughters. She'd been alone ever since, running a small farm on grief and stubbornness. We talked in fragments. She'd mentioned the weather, the aphids on her squash, the cost of chicken feed. I'd ask if her tractor was still leaking oil, if she'd fixed the hinge on the coop door. Over time, she started setting aside vegetables she thought I'd like: the straightest cucumbers, the least bruised tomatoes. I noticed she remembered I preferred Roma over beefsteak. I noticed the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, which was rare and brief, like a door opening a crack before swinging shut again. The girls never spoke a word. Not to me, not to customers. Sarah said they'd talked to Tom in her belly, but after he died, they went silent. A doctor called it selective mutism, a child's way of holding on to the world they'd lost. They communicated with whispers between themselves, tiny nudges and looks that could cut through a man's soul. Then came that Saturday in late August. I'd spent the week finishing a custom kitchen in town, sanding walnut cabinets until my shoulders ached. I drove to the stand expecting the usual routine. The same crooked cucumbers, the same careful paper wrapping, the same silent girls. But when I reached for my wallet, Lily, the boldest one, slipped around the table and tugged my sleeve. "Mama baked your favorite pie." Her voice was a clear, soft bell. Before I could breathe, Rose and Violet flanked me. "She remembered you said you like blackberry. She's been practicing all week. She's afraid you'll stop coming." I stood there, a paper sack of squash growing heavy in my hands. I had mentioned my grandmother's blackberry pie exactly once, on a sweltering afternoon 3 months earlier. I'd stayed longer than usual, helping Sarah carry boxes of unsold produce to the barn. She'd asked what my favorite food was growing up. And without thinking, I described that pie, the tart berries, the buttery crust, the way my grandmother's kitchen smelled like cinnamon and safety. I hadn't thought she was really listening. Those little girls had taken a throwaway memory and handed it back to me like evidence. Evidence that I wasn't just a customer. Evidence that their mother had been paying attention, hopping, practicing something she'd only heard about once. Evidence that I'd been fooling myself for 8 months. I looked past the girls to the white farmhouse at the end of the gravel drive. A curl of smoke rose from the chimney. The kitchen window was open, and I could see the edge of a checkered curtain fluttering. Inside, a woman who'd lost her husband was waiting to see if the lonely widower would finally stop pretending he was just there for the vegetables. I'd been a carpenter my whole adult life. I knew how to frame a wall, how to hang a door, how to build something that could stand for decades. But I had no idea how to walk up that drive and knock. Claire's voice was still in my head, telling me I wasn't ready. The empty house was still waiting for me every night. And yet, those three little faces were looking up at me like I was the answer to a prayer they'd been whispering to each other for months. I set the sack of squash back on the table. "Is there enough pie for 4?" I asked. Lily's face broke into a smile that could have lit a county. She grabbed my hand with her small, sticky fingers and tugged me toward the farmhouse. Rose and Violet ran ahead, their bare feet slapping the packed dirt. By the time I reached the porch steps, my heart was beating faster than it had during any roof job I'd ever climbed. Sarah opened the screen door. She was wearing a clean apron over a green dress and her hair was pinned up, a few stray curls damp from the kitchen heat. Her eyes went wide when she saw me. Then she saw Lily holding my hand, and something in her expression shifted fear, hope, and a raw vulnerability that made my chest tighten. "You came," she said, her voice barely audible. Before I could answer, the sky grumbled. A low, uneasy sound. The air went heavy. A summer storm had been building all afternoon, and now the clouds were turning a bruised purple over the hayfield. I glanced at the sky, then back at her. "I should probably help you close up before it hits. The wind out here can turn a hay bale into a missile," she nodded, already moving toward the barn. "The chickens are still out. I need to get them in." And just like that, we were working side by side. I latched the barn doors while she herded the chickens into their coop. The triplets stood on the porch, watching the storm roll in. The first raindrops hit the tin roof of the barn like somebody throwing handfuls of gravel. The wind picked up fast. I heard a creak overhead, the sound of wood under stress. I looked up at the old oak tree beside the farmhouse, the one with the rope swing Tom had hung before he died. A thick branch, maybe 12 feet long, was twisting in the gust. I saw the fracture line running along its base, a wound that had been waiting for a strong wind. Sarah was crossing the yard with the last chicken in her arms. The girls were on the porch, huddled together. Lily pointed at the tree. I didn't think. I ran. The branch gave way with a crack like a rifle shot. I threw myself at Sarah, wrapping my arms around her and spinning us both sideways. We tumbled into the mud as the limb crashed down exactly where she'd been standing, splintering into jagged pieces that scattered across the gravel. One of the pieces caught my forearm, tearing through my shirt. I felt a hot line of blood, but I didn't care. She was beneath me, breathing hard, eyes wide. Rain plastered her hair to her face. She looked up at me, not at the ruined branch, not at the damage, at me. "You're bleeding," she whispered. "You're alive," I said. That was the moment. The months of small talk, the careful wrapping of vegetables, the pie, the triplets' secret, it all collapsed into a single, undeniable truth. I loved this woman. I'd loved her since the first Saturday I came back, and I'd been too afraid to name it. I helped her up. Her hand stayed in mine. Rain poured between us, but neither of us moved toward the house. The girls were safe on the porch, watching with those solemn, knowing eyes. Sarah touched my face, her fingers tracing the rain and the blood and the years of loneliness I'd worn like a second skin. "I thought if I baked that pie," she said, her voice shaking, "you'd know, and you'd either come or you'd stop coming. I couldn't stand the not knowing anymore." I pulled her closer. "I'm here," I said. "I'm not going anywhere." And then, with the storm screaming around us and three little girls watching from the porch, I kissed her. Not a careful, polite kiss. The kind of kiss that says, "I have been waiting my whole life for this." The kind that changes everything. But here's the thing about storms. They don't just tear branches from trees. They uncover what's been buried. And what that storm was about to reveal was something neither of us saw coming. Something that would test whether this fragile new beginning could survive the weight of the past. The storm didn't just drop a branch. It tore open a secret Tom had buried 6 feet underground. After the kiss, we stumbled into the farmhouse, soaked and shivering and laughing like teenagers. Sarah wrapped a quilt around my shoulders, then another around the girls who clustered on the sofa with eyes as wide as dinner plates. The blackberry pie waited on the kitchen counter, still warm. Steam threaded up from the lattice crust. Sarah cut 4 slices and we ate in silence, the kind of silence that isn't empty but full of everything that's never been said. Lily, the bold one, broke it. "Does this mean you're going to be our daddy now?" Sarah's fork clattered onto her plate. Her face flushed crimson. I looked at Lily, then at Rose and Violet, who had stopped chewing to watch me with those unnerving, knowing stares. I knelt in front of her, leveling my eyes with hers. "I don't know yet," I said, "but I'd like to be someone who stays. Would that be okay?" Lily nodded solemnly, her mouth ringed with purple juice. Then Rose spoke for the first time I'd ever heard, her voice a feather. "Mama said you built a whole kitchen by yourself. Can you build us a swing set?" Violet added, "with a slide." Sarah covered her mouth with both hands, tears streaming. For 2 years her daughters had only whispered to each other. Now they were talking to a stranger in their kitchen, asking for swings. I didn't know much about child psychology, but I knew I was in deeper than I'd planned. That night I slept on the sofa. Not because I didn't want to be with Sarah, but because the girls needed to see that this was slow, careful, respectful. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind die down, and thought about Claire. For the first time in 3 years, the thought didn't hurt. It felt like permission. At dawn, I woke to a rooster I didn't own and the smell of coffee. Sarah was already at the stove flipping pancakes. She'd wrapped my forearm in clean bandages, her touch as light as a prayer. The girls sat at the table, drawing with crayons. A normal morning. The kind of morning I'd forgotten existed, but normal doesn't last on a farm. We heard the chainsaw before we saw him. A stranger in a white truck was already at the fallen oak, cutting the trunk into sections. I walked out, still in my borrowed shirt, boots unlaced. The man was in his 60s, lean and leathery, with a snake tattoo curling up his neck. He cut the saw and turned to face me. "You must be the carpenter," he said. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Who's asking?" "Harlan Decker, Tom's business partner." I'd never heard Sarah mention a business partner. I turned to the porch where Sarah had gone pale. The girls had retreated behind her legs. "Tom didn't have a partner," she said, her voice thin. Harlan pulled off his work gloves and walked toward the house with the easy confidence of a man who owned everything he could see. "Tom didn't tell you a lot of things, did he? That's why we're going to have a little talk. You, me, and the carpenter right now." Sarah's jaw tightened. "Whatever you have to say, you can say in front of my family." The word family landed in the yard like a stone in still water. I felt it in my chest. So did Harlan. He looked at me, then at the girls, then back at Sarah. "Fine. 2 years ago, Tom took out a loan against this property, $50,000. He used the farm as collateral. I was the lender." Sarah's hand flew to her throat. "That's impossible. Tom would never risk the farm. He built this place with his own hands. He built it and he was about to lose it. Harvest was bad that year. Equipment repairs, the new combine, the hospital bills from the triplets' birth. He came to me desperate. I gave him the money. In exchange, I got a lien on the property. If the loan isn't repaid in full by the end of this year, the farm becomes mine." I stepped forward, putting myself between Harlan and Sarah. "You're telling me a dead man signed a loan and now you're here to collect from his widow and 3 kids?" Harlan's eyes went cold. "I'm telling you the truth. And the truth is, Tom didn't just borrow money. He borrowed it from the wrong person. I own the note. And with all due respect, Carpenter, this doesn't involve you." "It involves her," I said. "So it involves me." Harlan studied me for a long moment, then nodded as if he'd confirmed something. "That's what I thought. Well, there's more where that came from. I'll be back with the paperwork. You'll have 30 days to pay or vacate." He climbed into his truck and drove off, trailing dust that hung in the air like a verdict. Sarah sank onto the porch steps, her hands shaking. "I didn't know. Tom never said a word. Why would he hide this from me?" I sat beside her. The girls were still inside, faces pressed against the window screen. "Because he was ashamed," I said, and because he thought he had more time. She looked at me, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. We don't have $50,000. The farm barely breaks even. I've got savings for the girls' school, maybe 10,000, that's it. Then we'll find another way. Jack, you don't owe me anything. You're not my husband. You're just a man who bought vegetables. I took her hand. I'm not just anything, not anymore. We spent the next 3 days digging, not in the dirt, in paper. Sarah dragged out every file, every bank statement, every receipt Tom had left behind. I called every connection I had in town, the county clerk, a lawyer I'd done work for, an old buddy who ran a title company. The picture that emerged was uglier than a lien. Tom hadn't just borrowed from Harlan Decker. He'd been trapped. Harlan owned a chain of farm supply stores in 3 counties. He'd extended Tom credit for seed, fertilizer, and equipment at interest rates that doubled every 6 months. When Tom couldn't pay, Harlan offered to consolidate the debt into a single loan secured by the farm. Tom signed because he had no choice. 3 weeks later, he was dead. The official report said the combine's safety mechanism failed. A freak accident. But my buddy at the title company, a man named Gus, unearthed something that made my blood run cold. 2 days before the accident, Harlan Decker had filed a notice of default against Tom. He was already moving to seize the farm. Tom died before the papers could be served. He died owing Harlan everything, Gus said over the phone, his voice grim. And here's the kicker, the combine that killed him. It was a demo model on loan from Decker's equipment yard. I hung up and stared at the wall. A loan from the man who wanted his land. A machine provided by the same man. A death that no one had ever questioned because Tom was a grieving father-to-be, overworked and underslept. It had been ruled an accident and buried, but it wasn't buried anymore. The storm had dropped a branch on an old root cellar door that hadn't been opened in years. When we cleared the debris, we found a metal lockbox inside. Inside that box was a hand-written ledger, pages of Tom's neat cursive recording every transaction with Harlan. And on the last page, scrawled in a desperate hand, 3 words that changed everything. He tampered it. Sarah read those words and nearly collapsed. He knew. Tom knew something was wrong with the combine. I pulled her into my arms. This is evidence. If we can prove Harlan sabotaged that machine, we can stop the foreclosure. We can even take him to the sheriff. Orleans County hasn't had a murder investigation in 15 years. Sheriff Boyd was a slow-moving man with a thick mustache and a habit of deferring to anyone with money. When Sarah and I walked into his office with the ledger and the death certificate, he listened with a patient expression, then leaned back in his chair. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, "Tom's death was investigated. The coroner ruled it an accident. You're asking me to reopen a case based on a note written by a dead man who was under tremendous stress. Do you have any other evidence? Witnesses? Anything that places Harlan Decker at the scene?" We didn't. Not yet. Gus at the title company called again that night. "Jack, Harlan's already filed a motion to expedite the foreclosure. He's got a judge in his pocket. You've got maybe 2 weeks before the sheriff posts an eviction notice." Sarah overheard. She was standing in the kitchen doorway, a dish towel twisted in her hands. The girls were asleep upstairs. The farm was quiet, but the quiet felt heavy now, like the air before another storm. "I'll sell the jewelry," she said. "My grandmother's pearls, Tom's wedding band, I'll sell the tractor. I'll work 3 jobs, I won't lose this place." I crossed the room and took the towel from her hands, folding it on the counter. "You're not selling anything, and you're not doing this alone." "Then what do we do, Jack? We're out of time." I thought about Claire. The night she died, I'd held her hand in the hospital and promised I'd be okay. I'd broken that promise 100 times. But standing in Sarah's kitchen, I realized I hadn't broken it for good. I could still be okay. I could still build something, not just a swing set, a future. "We find a witness," I said. "Someone who saw something the day Tom died, a farmhand, a delivery driver, a neighbor passing by. Somebody." Sarah shook her head. "Tom worked alone that day. Everyone knows that. There were no witnesses." I looked out the window at the dark fields, and then I saw it, a flicker of light in the old barn. Not electric. Candlelight. Someone was in there. I grabbed the flashlight from the drawer and moved toward the door. Sarah tried to follow, but I told her to stay with the girls. The night was cool and still, the moon half hidden behind clouds. The barn door was ajar, a sliver of orange glow spilling onto the packed dirt. Inside, huddled in the corner with a blanket and a candle, was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 12, thin as a rake, with matted hair and eyes that darted like a trapped animal's. "Don't hurt me," he whispered. "I didn't take nothing, I just needed a place to sleep." I lowered the flashlight and knelt. "What's your name?" Eli Parsons." "How long have you been sleeping here, Eli?" He shivered. "Since summer, since I ran away from the group home. I saw the farm, nobody around much, the barn was open. I stayed quiet." I remembered now. The county had a group home for foster kids about 10 miles east. Runaways weren't uncommon. But something in his voice made my instincts prickle. "Eli, were you here 2 years ago? In the autumn?" He looked at me, then away. "Yeah, I was here. I was hiding in the loft. I saw everything." My blood turned to ice. "What did you see?" He pulled the blanket tighter. "The man with the snake tattoo, he came before sunup. He was under the combine with a wrench. Then he left. And then the other man came out to work, and the machine, it just..." His voice broke. "I didn't push. I didn't need to. I had what I needed. A homeless boy, a runaway, scared and forgotten. The only witness to a murder. And Harlan Decker had no idea he existed. Eli Parsons had been living in the barn for 2 summers, surviving on scraps from the roadside stand, rainwater from the barrel, and a silence so deep he'd become part of the farm's shadow. Sarah had never known. Tom had never known. The boy was a ghost who slipped in and out of the loft like a barn cat. On the morning Tom died, Eli had been awake since 4 a.m., huddled behind a hay bale because he'd heard an engine he didn't recognize. A white truck, no logo, pulling up before first light. He watched a man with a snake tattoo climb under the combine with a wrench. 10 minutes later, the man drove away. Tom came out an hour later, started the machine, and never came home. When I brought Eli into the farmhouse, Sarah nearly fainted. Not from fear, from recognition. She'd seen the boy before, a fleeting glimpse on market days, a shadow near the chicken coop. She'd assumed he was a neighbor's child. Now she was staring at the only living soul who could prove Tom had been murdered. She knelt in front of him, her voice shaking. "You saw it. You saw the man who did this." Eli nodded, his thin hands clutching a mug of hot chocolate. "I'm sorry I didn't tell anyone. I was scared. I'm still scared." I knelt beside Sarah. "Eli, we'll keep you safe. But we need you to tell the sheriff exactly what you saw." Eli's eyes went wide. "The sheriff? No, no police. I'm a runaway. They'll lock me up. They'll send me back to the group home." The group home had a reputation. Kids called it the pit. I didn't have details, but I knew enough to understand his terror. I looked at Sarah. She understood. This boy had been failed by every adult in his life. We weren't going to be two more. "We won't let that happen," Sarah said. "You stay here. You're part of this family now. No one's sending you back." Lily Rose and Violet appeared at the bottom of the stairs in their pajamas, rubbing their eyes. They saw Eli and without a word walked over and sat beside him on the floor. Lily offered him her stuffed rabbit. Violet put a crayon drawing of the farm in his lap. Rose just leaned her head against his shoulder. They didn't know what he'd seen or what he meant to us. They just saw a kid who needed a place to belong. That settled it. The next morning, we called Gus at the title company. He came out with a digital recorder and a notary public. Eli told his story slowly, haltingly, in his own words. He described the truck, the tattoo, the wrench, the time of day, the sound of the engine, the way the combine bucked when Tom started it. He described hiding in the loft, too terrified to scream. He described crawling down after the ambulance left, seeing the blood-soaked dirt and running into the woods. Gus notarized the affidavit and filed it with the county clerk that afternoon. Harlan Decker found out within hours. The man had eyes everywhere. By sunset, a black SUV was parked at the end of the gravel drive. 2 men sat inside watching the house. They didn't get out. They didn't need to. The message was clear. We'd made a move and Harlan was answering. I called Sheriff Boyd again. This time I didn't ask. I told him we had an eyewitness affidavit and a notarized statement. He came to the farm that evening with a deputy, listened to Eli's story in person, and finally agreed to open a formal investigation. But he warned us it wouldn't be simple. "Harlan Decker's got a lawyer named Covington, best in the county. He'll tear that boy apart on the stand. Runaway, no family, no fixed address. They'll say he's lying for attention or that you paid him. You need more than a kid's word." "More." always more. The next 72 hours were a blur of phone calls, late-night talks, and a desperate search for evidence that might corroborate Eli's story. I started with the combine itself. Tom's old machine had been scrapped 2 years ago, sent to a salvage yard in Jackson County. I drove 3 hours to find it. The yard owner, a grizzled man named Stubbs, remembered the machine. Decker called and said to crush it same day it arrived. I thought it was odd, but he paid cash. I saved the engine block for parts, though. Rest is gone. The engine block, I asked to see it. It was rusted and oil-stained, but when I ran my hand along the underside, I felt something rough. Gravel embedded in the metal. But more importantly, I saw a small, deliberate notch in the safety lever housing, a clean cut, not a fracture. Someone had sawed through the steel just enough that the mechanism would hold for a few uses, then fail under load. I took photos, bagged the part, and drove straight to the sheriff's office. Boyd called the county mechanic. The mechanic's assessment was immediate. This was tampering, deliberate sabotage. And the cut matched the marks a specific kind of wrench would make, a pipe wrench with serrated teeth old enough to leave unique scoring patterns. Now we needed the wrench. Eli said the man had one. If we could find that wrench with matching wear marks, we'd have the physical evidence to back up the eyewitness account. But Harlan Decker wasn't going to hand it over. He didn't have to. Sarah remembered something. Tom had a tool chest in the corner of the barn, mostly old hand-me-downs. Before the combine accident, Tom had been repairing a fence, and a neighbor named Albert Morris, Alina's father in fact, the man with the scar story, had borrowed a pipe wrench and never returned it. Albert had died 6 months after Tom, but his daughter Alina had moved in with a farmer named Matthew Vale, the one with the scarred face and the quiet reputation. Their farm was just outside Wheatland, 2 hours north. I'd read about them in the county paper, a marriage of convenience story that had turned into a real love match. If Albert had kept that wrench, it might still be in his old tool shed. I called Matthew Vale, told him the bare bones of our situation. He listened without interrupting, then said, "I'll check the shed. If it's there, it's yours." 2 hours later, he called back. The wrench was in a box of Albert's old tools, wrapped in an oily rag. Matthew drove it down himself that night. He was a tall man with a scar that ran from his cheek to his collarbone, and he didn't say much. But when he handed me the wrench, he said, "My wife's father was a good man. If this helps put a killer away, he'd want you to have it." The wrench was a pipe wrench, old, with serrated teeth worn in a distinctive pattern. The county mechanic took one look at it under a magnifying glass and compared it to the cut on the safety lever housing. The match was exact. The wrench had been used to saw through the steel, and the handle still had a partial fingerprint degraded, but enough for the state lab to run a comparison. Harlan Decker's prints were on file from an old misdemeanor. They matched. Sheriff Boyd arrested Harlan Decker on a Thursday morning. I was there, standing on Sarah's porch, watching the patrol cars roll up to his property. He came out in handcuffs, still wearing that snake of a smile. He looked across the field, saw me, and stopped walking. "You think this is over, Carpenter?" he called out. "You think a wrench and a runaway kid are enough to bury me? You don't know who I am." Boyd put him in the car. The foreclosure proceedings were suspended pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. The farm was safe for now. That night, we celebrated. Sarah cooked a dinner of roast chicken and garden vegetables. The girls made a banner that said, "We won," in uneven crayon letters. Eli sat at the table, clean and fed, and for the first time he laughed at something Lily whispered in his ear. It was a sound so light and fragile it made my heart ache. But the celebration was short. 2 days later, the group home's director, a woman named Mrs. Crawley, showed up with a social worker and a court order. She'd heard Eli was staying on the farm. Harlan's lawyer had tipped her off. The court order demanded Eli be returned to state custody immediately. Eli saw them from the window and bolted. He ran to the barn, climbed into the loft, and refused to come down. Mrs. Crawley stood in the yard, her smile as thin as a razor, and told Sarah she had 24 hours to surrender the boy or face charges of harboring a runaway. Sarah didn't back down. She walked right up to Mrs. Crawley, holding the triplets' hands, and said, "That boy is a material witness in a murder investigation. If you take him, you're interfering with a sheriff's case." "You want to explain that to a judge?" Mrs. Crawley's smile faltered. She hadn't known about the murder. The social worker started flipping through papers, confused. I called Boyd, who arrived in 15 minutes, and told Mrs. Crawley in no uncertain terms that Eli was under the protective custody of the sheriff's department. He'd be staying on the farm until the trial. If the group home had a problem, they could take it up with the county prosecutor. Mrs. Crawley left, but the damage was done. Eli was terrified again. That night he wouldn't come inside. I found him in the barn, sitting in the dark with his back against the wall. "They'll take me back," he said. "As soon as the trial's over, they'll put me in the pit again." I sat down in the hay beside him. "No, they won't. Sarah and I have been talking. We're going to file for emergency custody if you want that, if you want to stay." He looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. "Why would you do that? I'm nobody." "You're the boy who saved this family," I said. "And you're not nobody, you're Eli Parsons. You like hot chocolate with extra marshmallows. You can name every constellation in the summer sky. You cry when you hear a harmonica, you matter." He was quiet for a long time, then he said, "I saw your truck that first Saturday. I was in the ditch by the road. You bought green beans even though you didn't need them. I thought, that's a man who doesn't know he's looking for something." I laughed, a short, surprised sound. "Too smart for your own good, kid." He smiled, a real smile, small and cautious. "Does that mean I can stay?" I put my arm around him. "Yeah, it does." The trial was set for 6 weeks out. Harlan's lawyer, Covington, filed motion after motion to delay, to suppress evidence, to discredit Eli's testimony. They hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on Sarah, on me, on anyone connected to the case. They found nothing, but the stress was wearing on all of us. Sarah lost weight. The girls started having nightmares again. Eli barely slept. And then the unthinkable happened. Someone broke into the sheriff's evidence locker. The wrench was stolen. The fingerprint analysis, the photographs, the mechanic's report, all gone. The physical evidence was gone. Without it, Eli's testimony was the only link between Harlan and the sabotage. And Covington was ready to destroy him on the stand. We had 1 week until the hearing on the evidence tampering. If the judge ruled the evidence inadmissible, the case would collapse and Harlan would walk free. And when that happened, the foreclosure would resume. The farm, the girls' home, everything Sarah had fought for gone. I stood on the porch looking out at the fields and felt a despair I hadn't known since the day Claire died. Sarah came and stood beside me, her hand finding mine. "We knew it wouldn't be easy," she said. "This isn't hard, this is impossible." "No." She turned me to face her. "Impossible is what you did when you stopped your truck the first time. Impossible is 3 silent girls finding their voices. Impossible is a scared boy in a barn telling the truth. We've already done impossible things. We'll do one more." She was right, but we needed a miracle. And the miracle came from the last place any of us expected. The county mechanic had backed up his report to a personal hard drive. The state lab had digital copies of the fingerprint analysis. And Matthew Vale, the scarred farmer, had kept a Polaroid of the wrench, taken on a whim, because his wife Alina had said it looked like something her father would have treasured. That Polaroid showed the wrench's distinctive wear marks in sharp detail. It wasn't the same as having the physical evidence, but it was enough to argue for a continuation. It was enough to keep the case alive. But it still left us with one unavoidable truth. The trial would come down to a 12-year-old runaway telling his story to a jury, while a rich man's lawyer tried to break him apart. And Eli would have to face the man who killed Tom, the man whose truck he'd watched pull away in the dark, the man who'd already shown he would stop at nothing. We had 6 weeks to prepare a boy to stand up to a killer. And I had 6 weeks to decide if I was ready to let my heart love again, fully, completely, with no safety net. Because losing this family now would destroy me, but walking away to protect myself, that would destroy me too. The storm had passed, but the real test was just beginning. The trial of Harlan Decker began on a gray morning in early November, 6 months after the storm that had dropped a branch and uncovered a murder. The courtroom was small, the wooden benches worn smooth by decades of county disputes over fence lines and water rights. Sarah sat in the front row with Lily, Rose, and Violet in their matching blue dresses, the ones she'd sewn by hand. Eli sat beside me, his hair combed, wearing a new shirt that still had the crease marks from the package. He was clutching a small stone in his palm. a piece of obsidian he'd found in the creek the week before. He said it helped him stay calm. Covington, the defense attorney, was everything we'd been warned about. Tall, silver-haired, with a voice that could turn an honest man's words into contradictions. He spent 3 days trying to dismantle our case. He called the county mechanic's backup files unreliable. He suggested Sarah had fabricated the ledger out of desperation. He painted Eli as a troubled runaway who would say anything for a warm bed. But every time Covington cornered him, Eli held that stone and told the truth. Clear. Steady, unshakable. On the 4th day, the prosecution did something unexpected. They called Mrs. Crawley, the group home director, to the stand. It was a risk. She could have buried us. Instead, under oath, she admitted that Harlan Decker had contacted her the same day the foreclosure was expedited, offering a donation to the group home if she retrieved a certain runaway who'd been seen on Sarah Bennett's property. The courtroom went silent. Covington objected, but the damage was done. The jury now understood that Harlan had been using every lever of power he possessed: banks, kids, the sheriff's office, to crush a widow and steal her land. The final witness was Harlan himself. Against Covington's advice, he took the stand. He wore an expensive suit and that same thin smile, the snake tattoo curling just above his collar. The prosecutor walked him through his relationship with Tom, the escalating loans, the equipment lease, the consolidation deal that gave him a lien on the farm. Then she held up a photograph of the pipe wrench, not the physical wrench which was still missing, but the Polaroid Matthew Vail had taken. She asked Harlan if he recognized it. He said no. She asked if his fingerprints had ever been on such a wrench. He said he couldn't recall. Then she produced the state lab report, the digital backup that had survived the evidence locker break-in. His fingerprints, the unique scoring pattern, the match to the sabotaged safety lever. Harlan's face didn't change, but his hands did. They gripped the edge of the witness box, knuckles white. Tom Bennett was a friend, he said. I would never hurt him. The prosecutor turned to the jury. Tom Bennett was a friend, she repeated. And yet 2 days before his death, Mr. Decker filed a notice of default. He was already moving to take the farm. Friends don't do that. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. We sat in the hallway waiting. Eli sat on the floor, back against the wall, eyes closed. Lily, Rose, and Violet took turns drawing pictures for him: a swing set, a barn, a family of stick figures all holding hands. Sarah held my hand so tight my fingers went numb. I didn't mind. At 5 o'clock, the bailiff called us back in. The foreman stood, a woman in her 60s with a voice like gravel. When she read the word guilty on the charge of voluntary manslaughter, Sarah collapsed against me. Later, I would learn that the jury had wanted murder, but the evidence couldn't quite prove intent to kill, only reckless disregard for human life and deliberate sabotage. Still, it was enough. The judge sentenced Harlan Decker to 18 years. The farm was released from all claims. The money Tom had borrowed was ruled predatory lending. The debt was canceled. Sarah was free. But that was only the legal resolution. The real resolution happened later, in the quiet moments that came after. On the day of the verdict, we drove home to the farm in a convoy of trucks. Matthew and Alina Vail drove down from Wheatland with their young son, a baby not yet a year old. Rosa came. Sebastian came. Father Thomas came. The triplets' selective mutism, which had cracked open that day in the kitchen, had been slowly dissolving ever since. They now talked in full sentences, sometimes all at once, a chorus of identical voices that filled the house with noise and laughter. Lily told everyone who would listen that her daddy was a carpenter who could build anything. She'd claimed me, and I'd let her. Eli's custody hearing was 3 weeks later. Sarah and I filed jointly. The judge, the same one who'd presided over the trial, took one look at the case, the boy's testimony, the fact that he'd lived in the Bennett barn for 2 summers, the support of the sheriff, the letters from half the town, and the drawings the triplets had made of a family with 5 children and granted emergency guardianship. Permanent adoption would take months, but Eli wasn't leaving. When we told him, he didn't cry. He just sat on the porch steps, turning that obsidian stone over in his palm, and said, "I've never had a family before." Sarah sat beside him. "Neither did I," she said, "until now." The farm began to thrive again. I built the swing set. I built a slide, a treehouse, and a proper chicken coop that could survive any storm. I took over the carpentry work I'd left behind, but I worked from the farm, building custom furniture in the old barn with Eli as my apprentice. Sarah expanded the vegetable stand into a small market stall in town. People came from 3 counties to buy her crooked cucumbers and overripe tomatoes because they'd heard the story and wanted to support her. But Sarah being Sarah, she refused charity. She insisted on fair prices and honest trade. She would wrap every purchase in brown paper with that same carefulness, but now there was joy in it. One year after the storm, on a Saturday morning in late August, I drove my truck down County Road 9 to the stand, just like I'd done every week for 8 months. Only this time I wasn't a customer. I was bringing fresh coffee from the house. Sarah was arranging zucchinis, her hair pulled back with a red bandana. The girls were playing tag in the hayfield. Eli was helping a customer load pumpkins into a car. I set the coffee down and took Sarah's hand. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you," I said. She looked at me with those eyes that had held so much grief and so much hope. "You've already asked me. That first Saturday when you bought green beans you didn't need. You asked me every week after that. You asked me when you ran into the storm to push me out of the way. You asked me when you stood up to Harlan. You asked me when you brought Eli into the house." I smiled. "That was all me asking, but I never got your answer." She stood on her toes and kissed me, right there in front of the produce stand, in full view of the county road and anyone who happened to drive by. "The answer is yes," she said. "It's been yes since the day you came back the second week. I knew you were different. I knew you weren't just buying vegetables." We were married in the town square that autumn under strings of lights strung between the wooden posts. Father Thomas officiated. Sebastian was my best man. Rosa was Sarah's maid of honor. The triplets carried wildflowers. Eli walked Sarah down the aisle, holding her arm with a solemn pride that made half the town cry. Matthew and Alina brought their family, and Alina and Sarah cried together in the way that only women who have lost and found love can understand. The surprising detail came at the reception. After the cake was cut and the music was playing, Sheriff Boyd pulled me aside. He looked older, tireder, but satisfied. "We found the wrench," he said quietly. Decker's nephew had it hidden in a storage unit in Jackson County. He was hoping to sell it after the trial blew over. We also found something else, a journal, Decker's journal. He kept meticulous records. It turns out Tom wasn't the only one. There was another farmer 10 years ago, same pattern, a combined accident. The family lost their land. Decker bought it at auction for pennies. We're reopening that case. I stared at him. "Another family," Boyd nodded. "The name was Morrison. A widow and 2 kids living in Arkansas now. I thought you'd want to know. It doesn't change what happened here, but it means Decker isn't getting out in 18 years. He's looking at life." I looked across the square at Sarah, who was dancing with Eli, spinning him in circles while the triplets laughed and clapped. I thought about how close we'd come to losing everything. I thought about another widow, another farm, another family that had been shattered by the same greed. And I thought about how sometimes justice doesn't just arrive. It rolls in like a storm, delayed but unstoppable, and washes everything clean. 3 years ago, I was a lonely carpenter buying green beans I couldn't cook. Now I was a husband, a father of 5, standing in a town square full of people who'd become my community. I'd driven down County Road 9 that first Saturday looking for a shortcut. Instead, I'd found my life. I found Sarah on the edge of the dance floor, breathless and glowing. I took her hand and pulled her close. "Did I ever tell you about my grandmother's blackberry pie?" I asked. She laughed. "You told me once on a hot afternoon when you'd lingered longer than you should. I didn't think you were really listening." "I was listening," she said. "I've been listening since the day you pulled up in that dusty truck. Every word, every silence, every heartbeat." The music swelled. The lights flickered. The people we loved danced around us. And on a farm at the edge of a hayfield on County Road 9, the widow's stand was closed for the day, the vegetables put away, the brown paper folded neatly on the table. Tomorrow we would open it again. But tonight we were a family. And the house that had been so quiet for so long was filled with the sound of children laughing, the smell of blackberry pie, and the certain knowledge that some things, the best things, are worth every storm it takes to find them. The soil on County Road 9 doesn't remember the storm anymore. The oak tree is gone, but a new maple stands where we planted it the spring after the trial. The stand still sits at the edge of the hayfield, same crooked cucumbers, same overripe tomatoes, same brown paper wrapping. Some things don't need to change. Our family of 6 has become a family of 7. Eli grew 3 inches and learned to drive the tractor. The triplets started school and finally stopped finishing each other's sentences, mostly. Sarah still bakes blackberry pie every August, and I still eat more than my share. But the story I've just told you isn't really about a farm, or a murder, or even a pie. It's about what happens when you stop pretending the detours in your life are detours. I was a man who thought his story was over. I had buried my wife, scarred my face, not the outside kind, but the kind grief carves into a heart, and I'd resigned myself to a quiet existence of sawdust and solitude. Then one Saturday, I took a different road. Not a grand gesture, not a plan, just a turn. And that turn delivered me to a widow who wrapped vegetables like prayers and 3 silent girls who saw right through me. It delivered me to a scared boy in a barn who had been waiting for someone to believe him. It delivered me to a courtroom where a community chose truth over power. You'll face your own County Road 9 at some point if you haven't already. A moment when the careful route you've mapped for yourself intersects with an unpaved possibility. It might look like a stranger who needs a hand, a child who wants a swing set, a job you're terrified to take, a love you're convinced you don't deserve. It might look like a choice between staying safe and being saved. The question isn't whether that moment will come. The question is whether you'll slow down enough to notice the crooked cucumbers, because the vegetables aren't really the point. They never were. They're just the excuse we give ourselves to show up again next week, to linger a little longer, to let the silence between words become something more. Grief doesn't vanish, it transforms. Loneliness doesn't evaporate, it gets filled, one Saturday at a time, by people brave enough to bake pies, to speak after years of silence, to tell the truth even when it costs everything. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever driven a road you didn't mean to take and found something you couldn't name, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. Thank you for being here. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. And next time you pass a roadside stand, buy the crookedest cucumber you see. You never know where it might lead.